Hello, hello. We're going to get started in just a second. All right. Well, let's get started. Okay, so hello. We are here for our chapter three session for How Not to Read the Bible by Dan Kimball. Let me get my finger on the mic. And like I said, we're doing chapter three, which is pages 36 through, that's right, pages, uh, mark it at the beginning, page 39 through 40, 57, excuse me. So 39 to 57, maybe I write it down before I try to get on live. Okay, so as is our pattern, I'm going to start off with some comments of my own, and then we'll open up to any questions or comments from those who are live with me today. So today's chapter deals with 2 points that Kimball wants to make, which is never read a Bible verse, and all of the Bible points to Jesus. So that first part, never read a Bible verse, he quickly explains in chapter 3 to mean you don't read a Bible verse extracted from its context. You have to read it in the paragraph it's found, in the chapter it's found, in the book that it's found, and also you need to put it into the context of the overall storyline of Scripture. Now, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about that part is that how often both people who believe the Bible and people who don't believe the Bible engage in this kind of extraction of verses out of their context. And so, very famously, you can take any two verses of scripture and make it say just about anything you want it to, right? So, my mother, when I was a young boy, taught me this principle very early on. And she said, the Bible says, Judas went and hanged himself, go ye there and do likewise. Of course, that's a joke, right? That's two different verses that don't have a connection to each other, and she's just showing that if you just put anything together, you can make the Bible sound like it's going to do anything. Now, in on pages 44 and following, to about page, yeah, should have marked, 53, Kimball lays out the overall storyline of Scripture. And so, again, for those of you who are not familiar with this, I did a teaching series on this a couple of years ago, back in 2020 during the pandemic, called The Story of Scripture. So, find that on our YouTube page if you've not seen that as well. So, I'm not going to go into the chart that he makes, but he has a very similar breakdown of how Scripture should be understood. We begin with creation, and then we go to the fall, and have law of the prophets, which is sometimes the way Kimball describes it, called redemption initiated. And then we have the life of Jesus, the cross, and the early church. And he puts at the end of that the redemption completed with the end times and the tying up of the end of history with that. So, um, if you're not familiar with that, please go to the story of scripture that we've had before, or again reference that chart. That is pretty much what I think he's going to go with for the rest of the book. So again, hopefully you're watching these videos in order. So you will see that he might be referencing back to this overall story arc of scripture. And so last time we talked about how the Bible is also separate books. So let me talk about how we square that circle. How can we say the Bible is individual books? And I've made the point that sometimes we're having conversations between two different books, right? So some books are responding to other books because they're written themselves through history. But then Kimball makes this point here, and I agree with him that the Bible is also one coherent story arc. So how does that work? This has to do a little bit with what we think of when we talk about words like inspiration or authority of scripture. What it has to do is that when we take these individual books, which have individual authors and they have their own individual context, we see that they are also contributing to an overall story. The Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament is laying down the understanding we need to have of who God is and what sin is and why redemption is needed and what the Redeemer is going to look like, be like, or bring for us. And then the New Testament tells us that Jesus is that Redeemer, and then shows us sort of the how we're going to apply that to our life. The letters that come from Paul, and from John, and from Peter, and the other epistles and books of the New Testament. So both can be true at the same time. And again, just to put a bow on that, you have to read a Bible verse in its immediate context, that is, in the context of its individual book, and understand what that book's argument or perspective or point of view is. And then you're going to align that with the overall arc. Where is that book's perspective or point of view fitting into the historical story, the historical narrative of creation to Redeemer to redemption? And then, so that was Kimball's third point or third part we're going to discuss. And then he goes to part four, or all of Bible points to Jesus, and Jesus loved this crazy Bible. Now, this again is sort of another way of thinking about that overall arc of what we call the biblical narrative. I heard a friend of mine a couple of years ago put it very nicely, and I'm going to steal his words. So, Ken, I love you, and I'm completely quoting you out of admiration and flattery. Flattery, excuse me. So, Ken told me that the ends of the Bible are the most confusing because they represent the farthest part of the story from the main character. So if you think about the Hebrew Bible, New Testament, right there in the middle where they meet is the Gospels, which tell us the life of Jesus, what Jesus taught us, what Jesus' example was for us, and the proofs that the Gospel writers have that he is the Messiah Redeemer. And then beside those, we have Acts and the letters of Paul, and we have the prophets, and those interact with each other as either pointing forward to the Messiah or pointing backwards to the Messiah. But then we get to the end, to the very first chapters of Genesis, or the very last chapters of the book of Revelation. They get really weird, right? We get these explanations or descriptions or depictions of the very beginning of historical time with the creation of the world and the very end of historical time with the judgment and redemption of the world. And those kinds of metaphorical language that we see out there doesn't make sense unless you understand that it's anchored into the person and work of Jesus as Messiah. Right? We can't make sense of a God who creates the world and yet lets us sin against him unless there is a Redeemer coming in the book. And we also can't understand why the justice of God and the love of God can intersect at the end of history in the way that we think about the end times or the latter days or the new world or however you want to understand Revelation without it being the culmination of this redemption process in history. So, again, the whole book works together because it points as a collection to Jesus. Now, you don't have to buy into that, but that's how the Bible puts it together. The Bible understands itself as a coherent story made up of individual stories. There's something to us understanding or being honest with that the Bible is trying to make an argument. It's trying to tell us not only a story, but a rationale on um, how history is to be understood um, and who Jesus is. And you can criticize that at one level. You don't have to buy in to what the Bible is selling. But that is why the Bible has come together, to make this argument for Jesus. There are other ways to interpret the Hebrew Bible. That's what we see in other religions that come off of that, like Rabbinic Judaism or Sadducean Judaism or Qumran or Gnosticism or other forms that emerged out of what we call the Second Temple period. But the Bible, as it's received to us in America in translation into English, is making an argument about Jesus. And we have to accept that's the argument being made, or we have to reject it wholesale. In one way, we can't really read the stories the Bible is making the point. We can't just pick and choose verses. We can't pick and choose chapters. We can't pick and choose books in the Bible without making another argument about what these verses or chapters or books are trying to say. So if you're trying to make an argument about Jesus, you have to accept the whole book. Now, we can then talk about what that means, who Jesus is, and all of these theories that we have in systematic theology. But what Kippel is trying to make in this chapter, at least the way I was reading it, was we have to read the Bible as the Bible presents itself to be read. And entering into that, we have to pay honor and respect that we can't go in and just, cafeteria a la carte a text without doing damage or rejecting the message of what we call the canon of Scripture, the whole collection of it. All right. So with that, let's see if there are any questions. If you'll just throw your questions or comments up in the chat, I'll read them. Although they are also popping up in the chat. So, does anyone have any questions? All right. If there are no questions, let me talk about what we're going to do next time. So, your next chapter is going to be obviously chapter 4, Strange and Stranger Things in the Old Testament. And that's going to begin on page 61. Flip over there. And it's going to take us through page 66. It's a very short chapter where we're probably going to get some descriptions of, it looks like, why. The question looks like it's going to be why do some of the rules look like they're going to be removed? So in chapter 4, we'll talk about that and we'll reflect on that for next Thursday. So again, chapter 4, pages 61 through 66, these are very short chapters. And we'll see you next time, live or on the recording. All right, bye.